Meine Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen. Mesdames et Messieurs, je suis enchanté. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Café Europa. Bruchim Habaim. My name is Vadim and I'm your host. As you travel throughout Europe, you probably know that coffee served differently in different places. Well, in Paris, Café au lait, in Wien, Wiener Melange mit Wasser, and we serve coffee with meaning. Please take a look at your menus. Jedem das seine, to each his own. And so you can find here hot appetizers for optimists, cold starters for pessimists, a Zionist main course, and of course some sweet desserts for the cosmopolitans amongst us. But we are especially proud today in our guests. They are young, they are beautiful, they are smart, and they're all Europeans. And you can find their bios as well on your menu. You can also find, on the last page, some of our regulars. As you can see for yourself, Café Europa has undoubtedly glorious past, but it's its future that bothers us. And so, dziękuję bardzo, Kosonem. Thank you for coming here today to think and to discuss with us the future of Jewish Europe. Before we start, allow me to introduce our staff today, our attendants that will help us to find some words of wisdom and perhaps even to exchange some exclamation marks for question ones. Shlomit Naim Naor, Adi Varon, Yael Katz Benitzcha, our one-man orchestra, Robbie Greengrass, our sous chef, Cynthia Zwiebel Navon, and our chef, Jonathan Ariel. E ahora una recomendación, one recommendation. Please do use the menu and the cards you were given at the entrance to write down and to share your thoughts or your questions. We will stop our discussion twice in order to allow you to express your concerns or your hopes, your questions, to make this visit to our Café Europa meaningful to you, to us, to Europe. I tak, my počínajmo. Here we go. Dzień dobry. I am Jan, Agata. Well, you're both from Poland, and groups visiting in Poland, both from Israel and North American states, often regard the place as the graveyard of European Jewry. We go there to mourn and to reconnect again with a sense of never again. From your point of view, and both of you as Minyanim alumni, how would you describe contemporary Jewish life in Poland?
I would describe it as a work in progress, as something that develops and changes dynamically, as a state of flux, as something that if you told me 5 or 7 years ago what we have accomplished, I wouldn't have believed that probably.
When you say what we accomplished, what do you mean?
I mean as a community, on both on the personal level and on a communal level. As you have to know that Polish Jewish community is basically a community of people who are reclaiming the Jewish identity. So when you talk to people, there are now Jewish leading young leaders, community organizers. 5 years ago, they probably weren't involved in the community. And I see, for example, in my community, where I come from, in the southwest of Poland, that if 5 years ago you told me that there would be a need for a Jewish kindergarten, I wouldn't have believed it, and now we're actually thinking of putting a grant together for it, because there are Jewish children that are reaching the age to go to the kindergarten. So it's it's really a place of where everything changes very dynamically.
Pani?
I'm not so positive as Janek is, and in my opinion, Jewish community in Poland lasts only because of the care of people from Israel and US, because many activities and programs and NGOs and kids camps are being organized and funded by organizations from outside of Poland. So basically, if that stops, the community stops. and the development of the whole community, which is, we call it revival these days. We can call it revival, but at the same time, people are spreading, they are moving to other countries, they are having identity crisis after going through all of the identity development and so on. And the lack of inside vibe, self-organization, grassroots activities is very disturbing, because people are used to the fact that they can go to Limud or send a child to Jewish kids camp, but what they do themselves, it's not really answered. So.
Interesting. So you're talking about help from outside, and Jan actually pointing out local, vibrant community. Interesting. Thank you very much. Dan and Alice, you are both soon to finish your Masa programs, right? So my question to you is, where and how do you see your future?
That's the everyday question. Every morning, every day, someone asks you, are you making Aliyah? Are you staying? And that's the question I'm not able to answer yet, because there is a lot at stake with that question. And as every young people my age, there's a lot of things to consider. But let's say first that it's hard experiencing Israel, then coming back to France. I'm actually very anxious to go back in the few weeks just for family matters, but I'm already anxious about it because I know I've changed from what I've seen here, and what I feel is different is that here I'm able to feel the Jewish community, whereas at home I'm among very different community, very non-Jewish, which I felt very welcoming in, and I grew up in, and I was very happy about it, and I still feel very French and very proud of that laïcité, and that we are able to be together and grew up and do stuff together. So I still feel very strong about that, and I still question myself, how can I do that and still feel that Jewish inside and be able to express that Jewishness more now that I know how good it feels. So it's hard to grasp that question and be able to answer it now, but every day there's a new answer, a new hint that comes to that way or another, but still the reflection is still going on, and yeah, I don't know if I will be able to answer it soon, but I'm working on it.
Thank you. I have more questions for you, but let's hear Dan.
I agree with what you said. I'm very connected and grateful toward France. But I have to explain that first I get into this Masa program with one main goal, which was to land softly in Israel. I wanted to make Aliyah, and I was looking for a good opportunity for me to come here. I did all my education in France, and it was kind of tough after my education to come here with, like in mind, the country was waiting for me. I'm not sure it was the case, so I decided to prepare my arrival here, and I found this program, Masa program. So for me, the question is not there anymore, because I already knew that I wanted to make Aliyah and I wanted to stay here. So I see myself here, Bezrat Hashem. I don't want to go back to France, even if all my family is still there, and I'm really very connected to this country. As I said, I see my future here. And when people were asking me why do I leave France and I go to this country, it was just after the summer. People didn't understand why I decided to go into this country. I used to say this, maybe the situation is currently good in France, but I don't see a light and good future for Jews in France. Whereas in Israel, maybe the situation is actually tough right now, but I'm optimistic and I see a very bright future in Israel.
This is fascinating. You mentioned reactions of your friends and and family to your decision to make Aliyah and to stay. I wonder, and for both of you, do you discuss the issues, what we read and hear in the tragic anti-Semitic events in France? How is it discussed with your Jewish or non-Jewish friends?
Yes. First, I discussed this a lot with my family and my friends, because after those tragic events, all my family and all my friends raised this question: do we still have the choice to leave, or should we leave now? And it was a hard question at this time, because it's a tough decision to decide to make Aliyah, to leave your country. It's very hard. I think it's not a good way to leave France, even to make Aliyah. I think to make Aliyah you have to choose. You shouldn't flee from anti-Semitism and other issues in France. But it was a really tough question. The situation right now, I think from my point of view and from people that I know in France, is not that bad. People should not run away from this country. But we do have the choice, and I think it's a good choice. When I talk about it with my friends who are not Jews, there is a huge gap in the mentality between the French society, the non-Jewish French society, and my mentality, the mentality of my friends. It's very hard to deal with, because from their point of view, this is kind of all what's happening in France, like those attacks are related to what's going on in Israel. And what's going on in Israel is mainly from their point of view. Because of Israel, the responsibility is on Israel. And this is a very, very huge gap between us. Just last word, I think from their point of view, and it's mainly shared in France, from what I know, they decided to side always on the side of the weakest, and not necessarily on the side of the most righteous. So once I understood this, I understood a lot more about the mentality in France and how they can go against Israel so violently.
Yeah. Alice? Do you have any Muslim friends or acquaintances back in France?
Yes, I do. I used to work with Muslims, and I used to work in an NGO that tackles social exclusion, homelessness. So there's a lot of people that come from Maghrebian country that try to work in France, and so yeah, I've worked with many of them, went to school with many of them, and I don't see, like, that's funny that you asked the question, because I never actually asked myself that question. Because I don't see, and I know a lot of people here always tell when I'm saying that I come from France, tell me, oh, there's too much Muslim in France. And I don't see the anti-Semitism coming from that population, basically, only that population. There's different type of anti-Semitism, and mostly when I talk to my friends, they don't see any. And they ask myself, did you encounter any anti-Semitism? And it took me a while to understand that I did, because my name is Levi, so most people don't say it to my face, because it's obvious that I'm Jewish, so they don't say it to me. And when I left my old job, someone told me, you know, there's been stuff that have been said about you when you arrived, that you were hired because you were Jewish and because the president of the NGO is Jewish. So that's why you got hired. And at the beginning, at that experience, I always thought they were hiring me. They were fighting me because I was young, because I was a woman. I didn't understand that it was also because I was Jew. So it's hard to realize that. And also at the same time, it was only my one experience of anti-Semitism, and I'm very proud to say, for example, that my sister, who has the same name as I do, is a teacher in a very difficult school near Lyon, where most of the class is Muslim, and she doesn't have any hard time with the parents or the other teachers. So there is a way of feeling safe in France, and you can feel safe in France, and I'm very upset with people telling me, oh, I'm not going to France this summer because I'm very afraid to go there. The people are going to be violent with me. They're not going to be violent with you. It's very hard because it's not the way it works. The way it works is that when you talk to people about anti-Semitism, Jewish identity, Israel, people tell you they are open-minded. Most of the time they're not, because when you start discussing with them, then you understand that it's very within the people very deeply, and it's a very old anti-Semitism. It goes back to Dreyfus. It goes back to very far away. People don't say anti-Semitic things anymore because it's taboo because of the Shoah. So they don't tell you, but they are anti-Zionist for sure. Most of the French people are against Israel and will use that to be against Jews and don't really know the difference between Israel and Jewish. And that's one of the things for me it's the hardest, because Jews of France don't get to vote in Israel, and I was always very upset when people attacked me on Israel because I was Jewish, and I always said to them, but I don't vote for the government. I'm not involved in that government. I don't do anything related to Israel. Why do you think I have something to say in what's going on, and why should I be responsible for what's going on? And I know some of my Jewish friends feel ashamed about that, so they won't say they're Jewish. It happens. Not all people do that, not all people act like that, but it happens, and that's something we must work on.
Thank you. Andy and Mila, you both live now in Israel, but deeply involved in what's going on in Europe. Andy, you as the chairperson of World Union of Jewish Students, and you, Mila, with your efforts helping the wounded in war in Ukraine. So I guess my question to you as both insiders and outsiders at the same time, what's the future you seeing for young people, young Jews in Europe? I know, Andy, what are the voices of Jewish students you hear, both throughout Europe and the world? And Mila, regarding Ukraine, what future could you see for Jews in Ukraine now?
So I think the first thing that we should establish that there are many various voices, as there are many various voices at this table. But I've been chair of WUJS for the past year and a half, and before that I was chair of EUJS, the European Union of Jewish Students. So I had the opportunity to have these conversations for around the past 4 years. And it's interesting you ask. I think the conversation a little bit shifted ever since I started my position in the organization. But in general, when we speak to students, and I'm speaking about young people who are very involved, because those are the ones I actually get to speak with, young Jewish student leaders from Europe. And most of the time the conversations are still very positive. People who are working to ensure the continuity of Jewish life in their countries. They are deeply committed to train their own peers, to provide meaningful Jewish experience during their university times, and these conversations are usually very, very motivating also for me who work with them and who bring these people together. Nevertheless, especially since the attacks have started in Toulouse in 2012, and ever since in Belgium and of course in Denmark, these conversations have come up, and I oftentimes find myself in similar panels speaking about the future of Europe or the future of European Jewry, and I always say that of course people are considering leaving. I was born in Hungary, studying in Austria, then lived in Belgium. Now I found myself here, and I think this story is very, very common for Europeans. I know at this table as well, many of us lived in different countries, studied, did an internship, worked, and this is Europe today as well. People move around a lot. It's also supported by the institutions. We get grants to study and to work elsewhere, to experience other cultures. So when we speak about European migration, I think it's important that also our generation is, in a way, we have the opportunity to be more flexible, and I think we also live with this opportunity. I'm in Israel now. I might stay, I might not. I really don't know. I love it here though, but there are a lot of opportunities out there, and I don't necessarily say that that Israel is a landing point for everyone. Someone who wants to come, I think we should encourage it. We should support them. We should help them when they land. To find ways to for their happiness and their success, but fleeing and this fear, and I know from France, especially after the attacks, many people somehow just packed up and left and came to Israel because you know that's what you do. And they found it very, very difficult here because they had a family, they didn't know the language. It's a beautiful country, it's a great country, but it's not the easiest country to get around. And many of them have gone back ever since to France because it was very difficult. And once that kind of initial fear went away, it was too hard for them to stay, and they left with disappointment. And I think what is our responsibility as Jewish communal leaders is to make sure to provide for the ones who want to come an easy way, but make sure that the ones who want to stay, and I do believe that there is a future to stay. There is today still more than 500,000 French Jews in France. And although 5,000 have left in the past year, my math skills are not great, but it's still only 1%. It's
interesting, from what you're saying, it seems that the considerations are economical or careers.
Often, I believe, yes,
but
a lot.
Not questions of identity. I mean, I live here or I stay there because of connection. It's much more flexible. And you're saying, if I hear you correctly, it's a generational thing. It's about
I think it's very complex. Also, I think in France, the Jewish community is a second, third generation. In the rest of Europe, I'm European as far as I can. Obviously, we'll come from Palestine at some point, but I think it's also a very different mentality where if your parents were or your grandparents weren't born in France, perhaps it's a different idea. Like a good friend of mine, you know, your grandmother was born in one place. Your mother was born in another country, you were born in a third country, perhaps your grandchildren will be born in this is a very Jewish thing as well. And not necessarily a bad thing, because that's how it's been, I think, all decades.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mila?
Well, I think I'll start a little bit from the personal story, because that's maybe a little bit subjective, but this is like I see that. The relations between Ukraine and Israel always were not so simple because of our history. But for today, what do I see like an insider and outsider? When I came here 3.5 years ago, I came here, I can say this was an adventure, really, open-minded. It was not something that I was planning to do all my life because I wasn't involved a lot in the Jewish community in my country. So really when I came here, I started my experience like getting to know more about Israel, about history of Jews, and especially about history of Jews in Ukraine, because really I didn't know about it. And I can tell that it really was hard because, you know, family, friends, and I think this is the story of each of us, that you start the new life on the new place, and you are starting just trying to find yourself, to find the place right here. And then I understood that there is something very important for me to find this link between these two countries. Because when I came here, I was 27. This is also already the age when you are, you know, not a student. And this is very important to feel yourself here, feel your place. And then you know that a year before, you know, everybody that in Ukraine started war that is going on today. And it happened that some of people in Ukraine needed help as today, because the situation is very, how we say in Hebrew, alapanim, very bad. And then they need help. They needed help, medical help. And the first people who came to bring this help to Ukrainian guys from the Maidan, from the center of Kiev, was people from Jewish community. And it's very interesting fact. And really young people and not young people who help to find money, to find opportunities, to bring these people here and to save their lives. And starting from that point, starting to talk with that people who were here, and they get to know about Israel, about what is Jews, what is Israel, because really I understand now that the question that is very important, that people in Europe, not talking only about Ukraine, not talking about Jews, talking about anti-Semitism. People that thinking good or not good about Jews, they just don't know what is that. They don't know any history. They don't know why are they should be afraid of Jews, or they should be aware of Jews, or they shouldn't be together or not together with Jews. I think this is the point that maybe it will sound very strange, a little bit strange here for people sitting here, for us, but we should maybe take into consideration our work that it is called Hasbara, and this is an explanation, but working on this point not with young Jews in our countries
Hasbara,
in Europe.
You mean Jewish Hasbara or Israeli Hasbara? Which of
I mean both of them. Mm-hmm. I think, but the Hasbara should work not only with the Jewish young people. Mm-hmm. For today, there is a place, first of all I'm talking about Ukraine, there is a place to start Hasbara with the people who are not Jews. Maybe, I know that there is, but this is very important because also Ukrainian young Jews, and not only young Jews, are very involved in the social and cultural and political life, and that's what we see. And also I should say that I'm a part of non-profit organization Israeli Friends of Ukraine here in Israel. And during this year we are helping to Ukrainians, not depends on if he is Jew or not, in all sphere of life, because like humanitarian help, medical help, and now we're planning some interesting project for children, for Ukrainian children of war, from the families who struggled, maybe one of the parents was killed in the war, and our plan is really to bring a group of children here to show them what is Israel, what is history of Jews, and just to let them be closer to the children of their age from Israel, because the age of 13th and 15th year is really the age when they should start to know about everything, about who are Russians, who are Ukrainians, who are French people. You know, this is very important, and I think we should switch a little bit the light to this point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Your trio, Nadia, Ilan, and Avi, your three are not only the subject but also the object of this discussion. As Nadia is you as the fellow of a Jewish People Policy Institute here in Jerusalem, as a journalist, as political analyst. Ilan is the educational director of One World Israel, and Avi for many years senior educator at Bnei Akiva and recently joined Masa team. For both your personal experience or professional point of view, if you have to point out what are the two challenges of Jewish Europe, perhaps both internally and externally, what would you say?
Ladies first, as they say. As far as I'm concerned, I would say that the two main challenges are not related to anti-Semitism as of now. The first is an internal challenge and the second is an external challenge. First of all, there's not one single answer that obviously is adapted to every country in Europe. Europe is very diversified and the Jewish community is as well. The first challenge, the internal one, concerns identity. I think we also heard it here with the answers of everybody. There are different conceptions of Jewish identity in Europe, in the European Jewish community. And as long as we were in the diaspora, we didn't have the State of Israel, it worked, and the world was not a globalized world as it is today. It was okay, but today we're seeing that the different identities are really causing some sort of problem in the sense that Jews do not relate to each other in the same way. They don't consider themselves with the same identity. The western part of Europe, for instance, considers Judaism as a religion. This, of course, after Napoleon basically asked the Jews to give up on their people identity, on the Jewish identity as a people. So Western Jews consider themselves as Italian, French, or English with the Jewish religion. Like, they believe in a different religion, but they are 100% Italian, 100% French, and obviously they're not seen that way from their country, their fellow countrymen. I think European Jews, especially in the western part of Europe, they have to start to understand that we are a people and it's an integral part of their identity, and it's very important for the second challenge, which is the way they relate to Israel. In Europe, at least in Western Europe again, which is the part that I know the best, there's a blind support for Israel. Blind. Everything Israel does is good. Everything Israelis say is good. And we have to explain Europeans that we are basically perfect and everything we do is right and everybody else is against us. But, well, not only, obviously, we're not perfect, even though we try to, on the one hand, as Alice said before, we don't want, or they actually, because I haven't been in Europe for 7 years now, I mean, I made Aliyah 7 years ago. European Jews don't want to be mixed up with Israelis. Israel does something bad, they don't want people to attack a synagogue because they have nothing to do with Israel. They don't vote for the government, but on the other hand, they want everybody else to understand that Israel is great, and they're very active in defending Israel. They have to kind of decide what it is, the way, how they relate to Israel, and how they relate to each other. Once again, in American Jewish identity is very different from Israeli Jewish identity, and very different from European Jewish identity. We have to find a way to cope with these identities together. And I think these are the main challenges.
Thank you so much. Fascinating. Ilan?
So I think I'll try and focus my answer on the British community, although I have a feeling from what we're hearing that things are resonating around the table, and we have similarities and some differences too. Actually echoing something that Alice said earlier, only when I moved to Israel, which was about nearly 5 years ago, I suddenly became really aware of this reaction about how outsiders see Europe and how outsiders see the Jewish community in England. And I was suddenly met with this sort of tidal wave of, is it not really dangerous there? And what about Islamization? What about growing trends of anti-Semitism? And it's something that I don't remember discussing. I don't remember dealing with it on a day-to-day basis back then. But it's something that became very firmly part of the, let's say, the discourse now that I'm here. And so if we're going to talk about challenges or main challenges, I think that there is a tension between security and insecurity, and maybe a fixation with that. I would put that on the list of challenges. And what I mean by that is that on the one hand, I grew up in a house, again, a personal sort of anecdote, that was very, very invested in the community security. My father actually was part of the group that set up the CST, the Community Security Trust, which sort of merged together the different organizations that were involved and responsible for the security of the Jewish community. So this idea of the synagogue with the guard was always there in all our awarenesses, but never really discussed and never really obsessed over, not that I remember. But now, when I speak to people back home, no one's talking about leaving, but they are telling you what was said on the news last night, and you'll see it in your menus that anti-Semitic acts doubled in 2013 to 2014. And I think there's that tension between security and insecurity, and maybe a community that is traditionally very established is losing its orientation a little bit and isn't sure how secure or insecure it needs to be. And I think that if it is a crossroads, then that's a big challenge to know where we're heading next. And maybe just to define a second challenge very briefly, maybe it's connected to this concept that people maybe see the Jewish community in the UK as one of the more established in Europe, maybe one of the more functioning. The institutions seem to work. There's a very strong youth movement network and Jewish communal life. On the other hand, I would say, knowing a lot of young people and working with young people now from all over the world, I would like to see a lot more diversification in the UK, more of a sort of a change from this institutionalization about how it is to be engaged as a young Jewish person. I think there's a lot of room for growth, there's room for change, there's room for being adaptive, engaging young people a bit more in new ways. So I would say there are two main challenges that I can see in Britain, and maybe that resonates with other people here.
Thank you very much. Avi.
So it's funny because Ilan said that you realized that you are different when you came to Israel, and my experience is that when I came to Israel 7 years ago, I think they took a few months until I realized that I'm European. There's no such thing as European. It's just a blank definition. And I think that you mentioned it, and then you mentioned it as well. The only thing that Europeans had in common in the last few hundred years is wars. So also talking...
And Yiddish. Yiddish was also there.
And
yes.
Yeah, but I'm Italian, and Yiddish didn't really reach us, so, you know. So again, I don't think that it's fair to talk about European Jewry. Maybe one of the challenges, just listening to you, is that we should start doing some research, understanding if there are some patterns that are related to anti-Semitism, that are related to cultural identity, etc., and maybe that would be one thing. But the two challenges that I thought of are a little bit different. The first one is that I think that maybe one of those patterns that I was talking about is that there still is a mindset of victimism in European Jewry. Meaning we still are afraid to raise our voice in a public area. We still are not relevant players in politics. And I think that we should change our educational paradigm and going from victimism to activism. I remember that last year for Pesach I went to Rome, and one of the Agadot that I brought with me, the Israeli Agadah, maybe some of you know it, there's one page just next to Veisha Amda with all the persecutions that the Jewish people had in history. And a very close friend of mine came to me and told me, please scan that page and send it to me. I want to print it, I want to frame it and put it in our shul. That's a victimism mindset. That means that we have nothing to offer. We just have to react to people attacking us. And we know that the environment is what it is. Maybe it's time for us to start being activists, to offer a positive image of European Jewry, to show that we are part of European history and culture, and we want to be a part of it. The second thing is more about cultural identity. And it's going to sound bad, but I think that when Zionism came in, and I'm a Zionist, I live in Israel, I think that Israel should be a cultural center for the Jewish people, but when Zionism came in 150 years ago, it offered itself as a solution to the diaspora. Not an alternative, a solution. You are a problem, Israel is the solution, everyone should move to Israel. And that crushed Europe's ego. European Jewish cultural ego, and also the identitarian ego. And now we see that in the world there are basically two Jewish cultural centers, legitimate. One is the American one, and the other one is Israel. But I still think that Europe could be a different, unique, and diverse cultural voice. But the main challenge is to be inspired. And I think that from this point of view, probably the responsibility is more on the US, American Judaism, and Israel to inspire Europe. Europe is in a bad need of inspiration. We didn't see any relevant educators, leaders, a few rabbis in the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years coming out of Europe, and I think that we still can do that, but Europe needs to be seen from world Jewry as a relevant, legitimate voice, but we still need some therapy to get there.
Wow. Thank you very much. Yeah, it seemed that I'm sure that the audience would love maybe to ask or to argue, but before we continue our conversation, and we're open to discussion, I would like to introduce you our expert. We are fortunate to have with us Dr. Jonathan Boyd. Dr. Boyd is the Executive Director of GPR, the Institute of Jewish Policy Research, a London-based independent research center and think tank that provides data and policy insight on contemporary Jewish issues for organizations working to support Jewish life in Europe.
One of the publications that my institute, JPR, produces every month is a digest of media stories about Jewish life in Europe. And in the course of putting together each edition of the digest, a certain type of headline inevitably dominates. Jewish leader warns that anti-Semitism in Europe is like the 1930s. Anti-Semitism hits new record in Europe. Jewish religion is under attack in Europe. Jewish life in Europe is dying a slow death. Are 150 million Europeans anti-Semites or dangerous idiots? Now, as someone involved in the social sciences, my primary interest is to ascertain the extent to which this narrative is accurate. And one of the things I've been struck by is how most recent commentary pieces about Jewish Europe draw on anti-Semitic incident data as one of the proofs of how bad things are getting. And indeed, there were more anti-Semitic incidents in Europe in 2014 than there were in 2013. These are the counts for the UK in dark blue and France in lighter blue. But the story is similar all over Europe, and certainly in Western and Central Europe. But the interesting thing about these data that have been quoted widely is that if we were standing here 12 months ago, looking at the latest data, comparing at that time 2013 with 2012, we would have seen the opposite picture, a decline in anti-Semitic incidents. And for some reason, there was very little commentary about that at the time. Few noticed, and even fewer wrote lengthy commentary pieces about it. And I posed the question, first of all, why might that be? Now, of course, part of the reason is that 2 data points are never enough. To understand trends, you need multiple data points across time to see what's going on. So here are the counts for the past 11 years for the UK and France. I think it would be difficult to describe this as a picture of increase over time. What seems to be happening is more a case of ups and downs with occasional spikes, notably in both countries in 2009 and in 2014, last year. So let's try and unpack what's happening. And to do so, it's worth looking at the British Community Security Trust data for anti-Semitic incidents in the UK in a little bit more detail. As well as publishing annual counts, the CST also publishes monthly ones. And this is the picture of what's happened every month from the beginning of 2004 to the end of 2014 in the UK. And what we see is a largely flat picture, punctuated by occasional huge spikes in January 2009 and in July and August 2014. And of course the timing is critical because both spikes coincided with major multi-week long conflicts between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza, Operation Cast Lead and Operation Protective Edge. And when those conflicts end, interestingly, the anti-Semitic incidents decline, settling back at around what one might call sort of normal levels. So the suggestion from these data is that we're not witnessing a dramatic increase in anti-Semitism over time, but rather dramatic spikes at particular times aligned directly with the explosion of conflict here in Gaza. But this slide, going back to this one, also raises another issue. If you look closely, you'll see that every year since 2006, there have been more anti-Semitic incidents in the UK than there have been in France. Now, this is really puzzling because I would hazard a guess that if you were to ask a random selection of British and French Jews of which of their 2 countries they think anti-Semitism is worse, they would come back with one overwhelming answer: France. But these data suggest the opposite. So what's going on? The answer actually has nothing whatsoever to do with reality in France or the UK. The answer is that anti-Semitic incident data are gathered in different countries by different agencies using different inclusion and exclusion criteria, different definitions of what is or isn't an anti-Semitic incident, all in the context of communities with different attitudes to and cultures of reporting in the first place. So in short, these French and British data, both of which are anti-Semitic incident counts for their countries, are not comparable with one another. The trends we see within each set of figures are sound, but comparing the counts with one another without a full understanding of how they were generated will lead to mistaken conclusions. But few commentators take the time to look beyond the counts themselves, and in failing to do so, they often misrepresent precisely what the data mean. But the fact that the situations in France and the UK are different leads me to another important issue. The situation in every country in Europe is different. To talk of rising anti-Semitism in Europe is to make a vast generalization. The Anti-Defamation League demonstrated this perfectly last year when it published its Global 100, a league table, if you like, of countries throughout the world, ranging from the most anti-Semitic to the least anti-Semitic, based on attitudinal polling of the general populations of over 100 countries around the world. So here's the ADL table, ranging from the Palestinian territories in first place, where the highest proportion of people hold anti-Semitic views, according to the ADL's definition, to Sweden in 100th place, where the lowest proportion of people hold anti-Semitic views. Now, the countries highlighted in red are all in Europe. And you can see very clearly that they're not all concentrated in one part of the league table. They're actually scattered across it. Greece and Turkey stand out as major offenders. They're in 17th and 18th place. But by contrast, the UK, the Netherlands, Sweden, all sit at the bottom of the table, with levels of anti-Semitic sentiment apparently lower than those found even in the United States. So Europe is not one place, and any talk of European Jewry is really to vastly simplify the reality. I'm always instantly suspicious of anyone who writes about what is happening to European Jews. There really is no such thing, as many of the young people just said, as a single European Jewish reality. And I don't mean that just in terms of different levels of anti-Semitic sentiment, but also in terms of history and culture and language and politics. Economically, too, Europe is comprised of countries with very large economies like Germany, the UK, and France, to tiny economies like Bosnia, Albania, and Kosovo. And even in the European Union, those countries highlighted here in bold, there's a huge variation along these lines. And, importantly, 80% of all Jews who live in European Union countries live in just 3 of them: France, UK, and Germany, the 3 largest economies in Europe and among the top 6 in the world. But we'll come back to that later. Let's move to another issue. Many have postulated that European Jews are starting to flee the continent in light of the terrorist attacks that have taken place in recent years. After Ilan Halimi and Toulouse and the Brussels Jewish Museum and the kosher supermarket in Paris and the murder of Dan Uzan outside the synagogue in Copenhagen, surely now Jews will leave. Well, let's have a look at the data to see if we can figure out what's going on. These are Aliyah figures from the 4 largest Jewish communities in Europe: France, the UK, Germany, and Hungary, over the past 20 years, from 1995 to 2014. And looking at the bottom 3 lines, which are the data for the UK in red and Germany and Hungary, you can see that the trend is, to all intents and purposes, flat. The UK figures are higher than they are for Germany and Hungary, but that may be largely because the UK Jewish population is considerably higher than the Jewish populations of Germany and Hungary. Only in France is the picture different. Again, one would perhaps expect the counts to be a little bit higher in France because France has the largest Jewish population in Europe, but the picture is more erratic, and most strikingly, the trend has risen dramatically in the past 2 years. Indeed, more French Jews made Aliyah in 2014 than in any previous year in history since 1948. So clearly something is going on there to prompt the movement. But a word of caution even about France. Our gut instinct, my gut instinct, based on recent events and the common perception that life is becoming untenable for French Jews, would guess that the figures for 2015 would be higher still. They'd go in that direction. But based on the data that have come out so far for 2015, which are just the counts for the first 4 months from January to April, it looks like the numbers are actually set to drop in 2015, albeit to a higher level than in 2013. And having inserted that word of caution, let me insert another. In the midst of any talk of an exodus of European Jewry from the continent, it's worth taking a look at these figures in context, i.e., what percentage of the entire French or British or German or Hungarian Jewish populations are making Aliyah. Now, looking at the proportions that made Aliyah between 2010 and 2014, you can see here that they barely made a dent. Over the course of the past 5 years, roughly 1% of British, German, and Hungarian Jews made Aliyah. The proportion for France is a little higher, it's about 3%, but that still means that 97% have not. There is no exodus going on. And just as a quick aside, this view of things also allows us to draw an interesting comparison with the 1930s and the claim that contemporary Europe is becoming like that again. Migration is actually a great measure of how people feel in a particular country because it's a real behavior. It's something people actually do rather than simply think or feel. And when things get bad, when they get really bad, people migrate if they can. So what happened over an average 5-year period in 1930s Germany? Over a quarter of German Jews fled at that time. A low proportion, perhaps when we think about it with the benefit of hindsight, but wildly higher than anything we are seeing in Europe today. Now, of course, the figures here for the past 5 years just refer to the numbers leaving these countries for Israel and not to anywhere else, whereas the German counts for the 1930s refer to migration to any number of destinations, so these are not directly comparable. But then again, Israel didn't exist in the 1930s, so there was no easy option for German Jews wanting to leave at that time, something that's not the case for Jews in Europe today. And either way, the fundamental fact remains. There is no evidence of a widespread exodus of European Jewry or any part of it. All of which leads me to one crunch question. Why aren't they leaving? I want to posit 5 reasons. The first is that they are comfortable. Most, as I said, live in 3 of the largest economies in the world, where in spite of the many challenges that exist, opportunities remain rife. As I said, 80% of European Jews in the European Union live in France, the UK and Germany. Forget Judaism for a second, forget anti-Semitism for a moment. These are all countries in which it's more than possible to live an economically good and comfortable life. So why leave? Reason number 2, it's home. These data come from a survey that we did for the European Union a couple of years ago, and they show that high proportions of Jews from many countries in Europe feel strong connections to the countries in which they live. Where the counts are lower, in Germany, for example, this is largely because most German Jews only moved there from the former Soviet Union 20 years ago, so they haven't yet had time to cultivate strong feelings of attachment. Reason number 3, European Jews are old. Looking beyond the simple sizes of the different populations, age distribution data tells us something much more interesting. A basic demographic principle. If more people die than are born, a population will decline. If more people are born than die, a population will grow. And when you look at age distribution data for most European Jewish populations, if not all of them, it becomes clear that they are more old than young. Or in other words, they are in decline. Professor Sergio Della Pergola is probably the world's leading Jewish demographer. And what's his assessment of the state of the 4 largest Jewish populations in Europe? France, aging. UK, aging. Hungary, aging. Germany, terminal. Now, the truth is both of these terms are technical terms based on an assessment of the age distribution in each country, but I don't think you need to have a technical understanding of demography to get the point. And of course, the critical point is that old people don't migrate. Some do, of course, but most don't. Young people migrate, people at the beginning of their independent lives when they have the freedom to do so. Part of the reason why European Jews aren't leaving is simply because many of them are old. Reason number 4. Yes, there's anti-Semitism, and yes, it's scary at times. But the truth is, in many countries, the mainstream political leadership has rallied to the Jewish community's side. And this is not just rhetoric. David Cameron, recently, the Prime Minister of Britain, recently announced a further £3 million per annum to help secure Jewish sites across the UK, on top of the 7 million or so that the British government is already putting in. And Manuel Valls recently announced a 40-point plan to combat racism and anti-Semitism in France last month, costing €100 million over the next 3 years. For the moment, at least, many Jews in Europe feel as if the government is on their side. And again, just as a quick aside, that's another reason why Europe today bears no resemblance to Europe in the 1930s. You know, after over 200 synagogues were destroyed and 91 Jews were murdered on Kristallnacht, there was no Nazi government plan to invest in securing Jewish sites or to combat racism. On the contrary, the Nazis charged the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks, which is about $400 million today, to clean up the damage. Reason number 5. Those pictures, the ones we all know about how awful everything is, they only capture part of the reality. There are other pictures too, of summer camps, of learning festivals, of cultural festivals, of interfaith endeavours. These are part of the reality too. Indeed, they're a far more common part of the day-to-day reality of many European Jews than direct experiences of violent anti-Semitism. In fact, In one of the very few pieces of research that's been done in recent years looking specifically at Jewish innovation and entrepreneurship in Europe, the authors concluded that Europe is witnessing a revival of contemporary Jewish life through the emergence of hundreds of new initiatives reaching hundreds of thousands of people. Now, with limited data to back that claim up, I think it rather overstates the reality, but there is much going on today in Europe to admire. And occasionally, the media notices that it's not all anti-Semitic terror and Israeli flag burning and quenelles. Occasionally, when we monitor the media, we come across other types of headlines, like defying European anti-Semitism, Hungarian summer camp points to renewal of Jewish life. Moscow has world's second largest limud. The largest, by the way, is in the UK. British Jews riding the wave of a cultural renaissance. Portugal okays law of return for Sephardi Jews. Jewish Culture Festival opens in Berlin. These are headlines too, all real ones, from the press over the past few months. And the truth, I think, lies somewhere between these types of headlines and the ones I showed you about anti-Semitism earlier. It lies somewhere between impending catastrophe and imminent renaissance, the title of a paper we published recently on this topic. There is anti-Semitism and there is anti-Israelism, of that there is no doubt, and I see little evidence to suggest that it's going to go away at any time soon. But there's also evidence of a government fight back in those countries. There's also evidence of cultural and religious vibrancy, and while some communities are unquestionably more dynamic than others, as is the case everywhere, that too will continue, although it will be challenged unquestionably by some of the demographic realities that exist. I'm always very wary of projecting forward too far. One of the things I think that Jewish history teaches us is that the future is rarely how we imagined it would be. So for the time being, I would say that the data suggest that Jewish life in Europe will kick on, challenged by momentary spikes in anti-Semitism that instill anxiety and fear, but bolstered too by a steely determination to create a dynamic Jewish life where we are. And in finishing, I suppose the key question for Israel and the rest of world Jewry is, to what extent will you be European Jewry's partners as they confront those inevitable challenges and create those new and enticing opportunities? Thank you.
I would like, as promised, to open a discussion to allow you, our guests, to raise questions, to share your thoughts and concerns. But I do also have a question for you, if some of you would care to answer. What should be or could be the role of global and established organizations like the Jewish Agency for Israel in the current situation in Europe? So please, if you have a question, please raise your hand. There's a question here.
We all know about the revival and renaissance of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Ronald Lauder has done quite a bit, and others. However, from what I see, from what one of the gentlemen said about Jewish life in France, the intellectuals, the Jewish intellectuals, are not in France. They're migrating to Israel. The great Jewish rabbis that Europe had are not in Europe. They are in Israel or America or other countries. So I don't understand when you say the revival of Jewish life in Europe. Is that Eastern Jewish life or Eastern European Jewish life, or am I missing something? The fact that there's the great Limud in Moscow doesn't affect Paris. And as far as what our agency does, it's always tried to reinforce Jewish life throughout the entire world.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
My name is Rabbi Tzvi Gretz, and I work with one of these global institutions, which is the Masorti Conservative Movement, actually in Europe. Been tremendous growth working with communities there. If you would have talked to us 5-10 years ago, it would have been 20 communities. Today it's 35 communities with young adults network, and a lot of work done in Hungary also, etc., etc. And the presentation, thank you to Jonathan Boyd for saving the day, literally. and really enlightening us with the facts, because what we've heard until now, and also the headline of the session today, should we stay or should we go, the entire concept is like, don't confuse me with the facts, okay? So thank you for bringing a few facts to the table here, okay? And the problem here is, and I say this as an Israeli, הייתי רוצה להגיד את כל הדברים האלה בעברית, אבל אני רוצה שגם ישמעו אותי פה, ושיבינו את מה שאני אומר.
Should I translate that? Yeah. Okay, go ahead, please, Rabbi.
I would have liked to say all of this in Hebrew, okay, because I'm born in Israel. My parents are American, that's why I sound a little bit American. But the problem for us Israelis, and I feel also a little bit for my brothers and sisters in North America, is that we have a little bit of a problem of denial of diaspora Jewry. And we really have...
Still, you think it's still going on?
In Israel, 100%, okay? Almost all my friends, everyone has the concept is, everyone in Europe needs to leave, okay? And the things that were said here around the table, but we have to listen very carefully to things that were said here about Muslim friends and colleagues, that their life is going on there, that the choices of people making aliyah here, okay, are not related to anti-Semitism. They come on Masa, they love Israel, and they stay. Metsuyan, that's the point of Masa. Okay, it has nothing to do with what is being tried to portray, mainly in the media and the headlines. And unfortunately, we ride on those trends and try to sort of like say, should we set policy? So what my suggestion is, hold on for a second. Okay, don't look at Europe as a graveyard of Judaism. Let's examine seriously what is going on there. Let's learn of the success stories and work on from there.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Mine is not a question, but a quick comment.
Yes.
I was in Eastern Europe about a year ago, and I visited a number of the main cities, and it's interesting that how different it is there from here. There are young Jewish people who were born of parents with communist upbringing or with no Jewish upbringing whatsoever, looking and striving to find roots, but no way to find the roots because there's no leadership there to establish it. Here we have, in the diaspora in the States, we have kids running away, unfortunately. But there is no one there. There are very few rabbis, there are very few people, cultural leaders, and they're grasping. I mean, one of the people I met was in charge of Jewish programming, and the highlight of her career was in the Warsaw, in the old central headquarters of the Communist Party. She had a Havdalah service, but she wasn't really clear of the significance of the Havdalah service and the whole Shabbat type of programming. So it's interesting how we can help them revitalize from here, how we can help them revitalize where they are anxious to have a local Jewish culture.
Well, you are saying almost the opposite. Say not help them run away, but invest and help them develop local Jewish life. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I'm interested in asking both John and the panel, particularly about the student age, which we didn't hear, I think, enough about. John, you know that we talked this morning at the executive of the Jewish Agency that there's likely that there will be more than 2,000 people going on Masa from France between high school and university, something that was regarded as completely impossible and unheard of. And if I assume that the age cohort in France is somewhere around about 6,000 people in this age group, maybe even less if it's a community that's getting younger, that would mean that 1 out of 3 young Jews from France may be just looking at the question of both studying abroad, not studying in France, coming to Israel, and we know that a large proportion of them, like we heard earlier, are actually coming either for soft landing or considering immigrating. So my question in general, and I know you did a study about students on campuses in Britain, which is, has life for Jewish students and the students here changed in ways that are a little bit different from the general trends that are being indicated here?
Thank you. Thank you much. We'll take 2 more, 3, and okay.
My name is Richard Prasquier. I'm French. I'm working with the current ISOD in France now, and I was the president of French Jewish community, the CRIF, for 6 years, between 2007 and 2013. So I have some degree of knowledge about what's going on in French Jewish institutions. I want to commend Jonathan Boyd for a very, very, very interesting and really mind-provoking presentation. I do agree with most what he said, and it's unusual to have this kind of balanced view of what's going on and to see the differences between the countries. I do not agree with what you said about European Jewish institutions are going down the drain. I do not agree with what you said about the fact that we are too much thinking about the Holocaust and the victimization. If there is a problem in Jewish life in Europe, and it is true that there is a problem in cultural Jewish life, it's because the victims of the Holocaust were in Europe. In some way, Europe is a graveyard. We have to know it. We have to resuscitate. We try, the previous generation tried to resuscitate it. With different degrees of success, but they try to do it, and I think you should not despise the work that has been done and that is still being done in European countries. France is not a cultural desert for Jewish life. There are a lot of French intellectuals, they speak French. They speak French. Many of them do not speak English. One of the major differences is generation differences. You have here a lot of young people who speak English on a marvelous way. French Jews who speak English in this way, you will not find them in the previous generation. So this is a problem that you do not know the countries because of the language. One of the things I wanted to just mention is the difficulty in in putting together the anti-Semitism and the fear and the drive to go away. In one of the most interesting of your slides, you mentioned that Sweden is maybe the less anti-Semitic country in Europe. Am I true? Yeah. So this is at least this was the result of the ADL. If you speak to a Jew of Malmö, living in Malmö, where most of the Malmö Jews had to leave the city because of anti-Semitic acts, he will certainly not agree with this. So you have, on the one way, the statistics of anti-Semitism, and the other way, you have the fear, and this fear is very very heavily related to the severity of the terror attacks occurred in France. Yes. So we have this feeling, and this is true. Nobody spoke. You spoke a little bit about it.
Thank you very much.
But this is the last thing I would say, because this is extremely important. Nobody spoke of the Muslim population. The Muslim issue this was like a politically correctness not to speak about it. We never speak about it. When the Charlie Hebdo occurred, the first thing that the President of the Republic said, this has nothing to do with Islam. So we do not speak about this. This is a very, very huge problem. It is a very, very important argument because we don't think that this problem will improve in the years to come. And this is a major issue.
Merci beaucoup. And I hope you all noticed that there was a Frenchman complimenting Englishmen and arguing with Italian. Yes.
Michael Wilde from New Orleans, an Englishman from the last French colony in the United States. I have two brief questions. The first is, I really have a problem with the way this session is framed. Should they leave or should they stay? And I think that's not a question that we can be asking here. I think that is a question that French and British and Hungarian and Italian and Spanish juries need to ask themselves. The question that we need to ask, and I'd love to hear our panel's take on, is what can we as a Jewish agency, or Jews in diaspora, what can we do to help European Jews be strong communities and to make their own decisions? The second question is, we know that there are many European Jews that are leaving Europe. We know those that are coming to Israel because we have great statistics on Aliyah, obviously. But there are Jews from Europe that are leaving for the United States, for Canada, South Africa, Australia, and places like that. And we don't have those numbers, unfortunately, but they're probably bigger than we would like to hear. So my question to you also is, how can we, for those who actually make the decision to leave, how can we make Israel the most attractive proposition for European Jews who, if they do actually want to leave?
Yeah, thank you very much.
My name's Jill Kaplan. I'm from London. I'm involved in the Masorti movement in England and have been for the last 20 years, and also with the Masorti movement across Europe for the last 20 years. There have been several things said here today that I find very difficult. One that other people have addressed, which is about the fact that there is no such thing as European Jewry. There's English Jewry, there's French Jewry, there's Italian Jewry, there's Hungarian Jewry. Every country has its own history and its own problems and its own growth. Someone asked where were the important rabbis, where was the culture, where was European, what's happened to European Jewry? Limud in the UK is larger than any limud across America. Limud is growing across Europe. Limud was started, even though it is now in America, was started in Europe. It's a European innovation. One of the great guest speakers at one of the previous Board of Governors meetings that I was at was Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who is the ex-chief rabbi of Great Britain, not my chief rabbi, but a prominent, clever, brilliant man who is accepted around the world as a major innovative thinker. He's not the only one. There are major speakers and major rabbis across France and across the rest of Europe as well. Somebody else referred to Hungary. 2 minutes. Somebody else referred to Hungary.
Just hold the microphone. People can. Yes.
Sorry, Hungary.
Yes.
Someone else referred to Hungary. In Hungary, there are a revival of young people who, as someone mentioned, have no background in Judaism. Their parents were communists post the Second World War. These young people are not only striving to find their own Judaism, they are finding their own Judaism. They're creating synagogues, they're creating youth groups, they're creating cultural groups. You say, where can the help come? The help comes to groups like that. Young people across former Eastern Europe who are looking for support, who want to be Jewish, who don't want to leave. We owe them a debt.
Yes.
And we do have to support them.
Thank you.
I
Thank you
could
very
go
much.
on, but
Thank you very much.
I'm Rabbi Dan Freelander. I'm president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism. I very much appreciated this panel because what I'm learning most today is the danger inherent in us buying into any one narrative about European Jewry. There are multiple narratives. And that may have been the situation for many years, and I think will continue to be. Here are two dualities, Eastern Europe and Western Europe. We've heard a lot of examples here of the young revival in Eastern Europe from families, individuals that have minimal or no Jewish background. Incredible opportunity for the Jewish people. And the more we can give them leadership within Eastern Europe, here I'm thinking rabbinic and different Jewish professional leadership that leads young people to Jewish study, that leads them to spend time in Israel, that leads them to build a Jewish life in Eastern Europe. This benefits the entire Jewish people. It's a revival, not of the aged, of the young. In Western Europe, we have a totally different narrative. In Western Europe, there's extraordinary anger, I'm feeling in my visiting to Belgium and France, towards the Jewish establishment for asking questions like, should we leave? They want the question to be, how do we build the strongest possible Jewish community where we live in Europe so that we and our children have the opportunity to live where we choose to live? That, I think, should be the focus of the Jewish agency, of the Jewish people. That's the reason that all the young people sitting around the table have made it to programs here. We're giving them the opportunity to choose how to live their Jewish lives And that is the mission of this agency.
I'll give opportunity both for Dr. Boyd and for you to respond. But before that, please take a look.
The word Europe itself, it's not a word. It's a Rorschach ink blot. You know those special ink blots that psychologists use so that people look at them and they can figure out who the people are, what their fears are, and whatever. That's the word Europe. So you can't really assume by talking about a European Jewish identity that it is just a geographic place. No, it will make vibrating chords in the minds of Jews around the world that in many ways already handicap the concept. Europe was where Jewish life used to be. Europe was the place in which Jewish life was murdered, 2/3 of the Jews. Europe was the place from which American Jewry came, and Europe was the place from which Israel came. And Shlomo Avineri's words, of course, Israel is of Europe, but not in Europe or even European. So it's not a neutral term. It's not like talking Southeast Asia or Northwest Canada or something like that. And the term crosses the historical divides. In other words, it takes 2 seconds from people chatting about Europe and how nice the European Union is and how useful it is for biological research or something, to revert immediately to the notion of the Europe of the horror. It takes 2 seconds, which means that we're still in very unsolvable, very wet lands. You can't walk steadily with this concept. In the moment of the Iraq War, when France and Germany went toward Russia against Bush, who was going to launch America into the Iraq War, the reaction of most American Jewry was that Europe was back at Munich 1938. This gives you an idea of how close we are, 60 years, 70 years is nothing, to reverting to the notion of the European as the horror of the past. Christian Europe, Nazi Europe is worth. So the European Jewish identity is already loaded with this very complex term. On top of it, what do we mean by Europe? Is it the 27 countries of the European Union? Where is Switzerland in that case? Is it the wider continent? Not so easy
You
either.
won't come down on the big question then. Is it time for the Jews of Europe to leave?
I understand those who do. I really do. Despite the irony that they'll get to Israel and there'll be paratroopers protecting them there too. I mean, that's kind of a cheap irony.
The only way I can answer this question is very personally, which is to say the following, that at my synagogue in Washington, D.C., we often will have services outside. The thought of doing that in Europe it's an impossibility. You can't do anything out in the open anymore, and it seems like a very straitened, narrow, and archaic way to live, given that there are alternatives. All that said, I can't sit in judgment of anybody who is in a place and they've been in a place for generations. And I also admire, I do admire those who say they want to stay and fight. Yeah. And you have a very practical,
The Jews, in fact, do need to all leave Europe. What would be the most Jewish thing for the last Jew to do? The most appropriate, fitting thing?
One said that the last thing that a Jew should do when he or she leaves Europe is spit. I mean, I think that if
the Jews' last sigh.
Yeah, well, exactly. But if the Jews leave Europe, I have to say I will regard it in some ways as sad, but I won't regard it as tragic, because I think the tragedy of Europe and the Jews has been in operation for
There's been plenty of tragedy
we're
already.
well past the.
I mean, this is not.
We're well past
But this
the
is
moment.
what I mean.
We're
This is,
well
and you
past the
heard
moment.
this. This is what Hitler wanted.
Well,
you know,
I'm not worried about giving Hitler posthumous victories. I mean, I'm worried about the safety of the Jews and the flourishing of Jewish identity.
Not all the Jews are going to leave, so
right.
it's not going to happen. B, one of the things you realize when you travel around these places is that the Holocaust was extraordinarily effective. Poland is, I guess, probably the most obvious example. Poland, which had 3 million Jews before the Holocaust, has now, I think, roughly 30,000 or so. Hitler lost the war, but he won much of what he wanted to win, and it's a sad fact, and it's true, and therefore I like Leon. I don't see it as a terrible tragedy if the Jews leave Europe. The tragedy happened.
But you did say earlier that it would also be
The dreadful events in Paris are a reminder of the serious terrorist threat that we face. But the attack on a Jewish supermarket where 4 people were killed is a chilling reminder of anti-Semitism, not just in France, but the recent anti-Semitic prejudice that sadly we have seen in this country. And I know that many Jewish people in this country are feeling vulnerable and fearful, and you are saying that you are anxious for your families, for your children and yourselves. I never thought I would see the day when members of the Jewish community in the United Kingdom would say that they were fearful of remaining here in the United Kingdom. And that means that we must all redouble our efforts to wipe out anti-Semitism here in the United Kingdom. Following those attacks in Paris, we saw a tremendous expression of unity as people came together in solidarity with the victims and with France. People in countries all over the world repeated, "Je suis Charlie, je suis Ahmed, je suis Juif." But the most important quote I heard, I think, was from the French Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, who said, "If 100,000 Jews leave, France will no longer be France. The French Republic will be judged a failure." It is a sentiment I well understand, and one that holds true for Britain. Without its Jews, Britain would not be Britain. Just as without its Muslims, Britain would not be Britain. Without its Sikhs, Hindus, Christians and people of other faiths, Britain would not be Britain.
Okay, so a voice from Poland. Because we feel that we noticed that we're kind of overlooked in the presentation as well. Apart from the anti-Semitism,
very extremely anti-Semitic.
Yes, that's the thing. And a picture from Krakow, I think, right? So, well done. So anyway, I'm listening to everything and I'm thinking, and I will explode in a second if I will not say it all, but I will try to wrap it up.
Focus.
And, focus and slow. Yes. Okay. So the thing is like this, if I hear people like speaking around me, there's panelists and speakers from the audience and all of the videos and so on, I ask myself a question, is it out of, what is the perspective? It's either negative or positive. Is Zionism created because of the despair or because of the hope? So there are always two ways. Am I running away to live in Israel? Am I running away from something? Or am I developing myself and my identity to live there because I want something? So we have fear and hatred, and we have light and love. Yes? So basically, if we look at things from the perspective of fear, which is present in the Europe, not European Jewry, because I'm also against saying that there is something like European Jewry. Because
I'm sorry, you feel that fear in Poland? Like
of course.
Experience anti-Semitism?
Yes,
you do.
Remember 3 years ago in Budapest when we were having the... But we were having SWOT presentations of our communities.
Yes.
We were the only ones who did not include anti-Semitism as a threat. And 3 years later, I must admit, we were mistaken, because it is there. But what is the shape of anti-Semitism is a different question. We don't have anti-Semitism coming from Muslim communities. We have stereotypes not being revised, living in the culture, being a cultural imprint. So where I'm around my friends, I do not ever face anti-Semitism in Poland, because Polish people run in in their own circles, and you don't get to meet that kind of people. Right. But for instance, recently I finished a play for national television about Polish-Jewish relations, and the producer made a censorship on our play because he said this is anti-Polish and is offensive to Polish people. And we were talking about taking over real estate after the war. We were talking about, we call it hooligans anti-Semitism from 1968, and also hooligans repeating the cliches and so on. And we had to, because otherwise it would not go to further. So there's a censorship, okay. No. This is not what I wanted to say. I need to say that, please. So the thing is that you are talking about, cut off all of the things and I will get to the point. We need to answer ourselves, what is more important, my needs, my life conditions, or threats, or the idea? And where does the idea come from? If it comes from fear and hatred, I think it's wrong. But if it comes from love and light, I think it should be developed. So if you ask us, what do you want, what you should do to make us come over here, or to, focus more on revival of our community, it's about the concept, because concept wins over the conditions if it's stronger. I'm afraid, and I live in Europe, and I'm also afraid when I'm in Israel, but at the same time, I would like to have a strong concept, honest concept, that is making me believe more and fight for against conditions and threats. That's the point, because life is life, And if you ask, why, I think that all of the anti-Semitism coming from Muslim communities in France, I used to live in Belgium, it was very scary moment of my life when it came to Jewish activities and so on. It comes because, I believe that Europeans thought that you should, trigger your frustration on the underdog, and Jews are victimized in Europe.
Yes.
Therefore,
there's one quote of one of the amazing thinkers, early Zionist, Aleph Dalet Gordon, who says that instead of fighting the darkness, you should bring more light to the world.
Yes.
So I totally agree with what you're saying. Thank you very much. Yes, Dan.
I would like to add something, because I've experienced something very different from what have been said so far in France. I worked in a startup, before coming here, I worked in a startup for 2 years, approximately, and I experienced weekly or daily anti-Semitism. From naive questions, like, is it true that you Jews don't want to marry non-Jewish women because they are not good enough for you? To more direct and more strong anti-Semitism straight into my face, like, you killed children in Israel. You are ruling finance, you are ruling media, you try to control the world. And more than that, I know now from the last 2 or 3 years, the anti-Semitic speech is now totally freed. Has been freed by many different things. Social networks, it's terrible. If you look on the social networks, how people talk about Jews, it's seriously scary. And also about some people, very important figures in France. Like, you heard about those people, like Dieudonné, Alain Soral, and other people like that. So it's now totally free, and that's why I don't really feel that the situation is totally different from what happened in the 30s. True, it's different, but still, the difference are mainly, I think, people are hiding their anti-Semitism behind anti-Zionism, and that's why I think we shouldn't distinguish ourselves from what's happening in Israel. I'm not saying that we should defend Israel anytime. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we, our Jews, are connected to Israel. Whatever we say, whatever we think about it, we're connected to it. Yeah. But a lot of Jews are experienced what I've experienced before, and many of my friends left not necessarily for Israel, but for the US, for Canada, and for many other countries. You talked about the French Jews, now the young generation of French Jews who are speaking English. Most of my friends from the equivalent of the Ivy League in France are leaving the country, and they speak English, so they are able to leave the country and to live in other countries. And this is happening right now. So this is basically what I wanted to say. It was, for me, important to share this experience, which is very different from what we've heard about the first challenge for Jews in Europe are their own issues or victimization and stuff like that. I've experienced much more than that, and my identity went through my Judaism, and that's why I also thought that I had to leave, because my Judaism is also my identity, and it was one of my main issues in France.
Two things. The first thing, just to explain, maybe to sharpen a little bit what I said about victimism and activism, I think that actually what you said explains it all. I'm definitely not minimizing the Holocaust, but I don't think that we should use it as an educational tool to educate to our Jewish identity. The process that Dan went through is exactly what we should aim to from an educational point of view, and the Holocaust should be something that we should be aware of, but not the main component of our identity. Now, the second thing that I wanted to explain is about basically answer to all those people that disagreed with me about the cultural point, and hopefully you'll disagree also afterwards, and also referring to what Dr. Boyd said. It is right that there are a lot of new activities and new congresses going on in Europe, but I think that the big question is who goes to those activities, and there are two sad answers. The first one is that the participants are the inner circle of the communities. The first, second, third circle, the people that are already committed to the communities, they're already involved in communal activities, and I don't think that there are a lot of activities that aim specifically to reach those outer circles, what we like to call the invisibles, and that there will keep being invisibles if we don't gear our activities specifically for them. And the solution for that is too long for this panel.
And you think, from your experience, Limud is not meeting those challenges?
I think that it depends on the countries, and I think that what Limud tries to do is amazing, is bringing a pluralist voice to a Europe that needs it very, very badly, but I wonder how many people that are part of those outer circles that are not involved in communal activities go to Limud. Right. The last thing that I wanted to say, just one thing, to answer what Mr. Will said before, that's the answer. That's what I think the Jewish Agency should focus on. How to create activities that don't have to be justified afterwards by showing a lot of pictures so that at the end of the day, who organizes them brings all the very known people, but actually activities that even 2 or 3 people for those outer circles will come are going to be a success, and the budget put for them is going to be worth it. The very last thing, yes. You're right, Rabbi Sachs is a huge celebrity, and he's British. Not sure if European is the right definition as well, but I challenge you...
Well, they're not on the continent, but they are European. I mean,
yeah, Lonaim, he's just next to me, I can't say anything. But besides that, I would challenge you to go around and talking to all of the American people that we have here and ask them how many relevant intellectual or activist figures do you know coming from Europe. I think that besides Rabbi Sachs and maybe Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardozo, I don't think that many names will come up.
I encourage you all continue this conversation after we finish, and you're all, of course, invited to lunch. But I want to have the opportunity that Dr. Johnson Boyd will also answer your remarks, your closing remarks, please.
Let me respond to a few specific points, and then I will make some more general ones. Alan, you asked a question about students. The first thing I would say is there isn't a whole lot of data, actually, on Jewish students in Europe. There is the survey that we did of the UK, but there's not a whole lot else. My rough estimate of how many Jewish students there are in France, or how many people there are in the student age band, is probably about 20 to 25,000. So that's where I would put it. But more importantly, what are students thinking about? Who are Jewish students today? I would say that the point that was made in the cafe over there about movement, about experiencing different countries is part of the reality. There are all sorts of opportunities, and Israel is one amongst many, and increasingly so. One of the things that the European has done is created a borderless Europe where people can come and go much more freely than they used to be. And the other thing I would say is that, based on the survey that we did in the UK, what are Jewish students primarily concerned about? Not just on campus, but generally, it's not anti-Semitism and it's not anti-Israelism. It is passing their exams, it's finding a job, it's living up to the expectations of their parents, and it's finding a boyfriend or girlfriend. That's really what students are concerned about, as I'm sure we were all concerned about when we were students too. I apologize for overlooking Poland and not talking about Poland a little bit more. I only had 15 minutes. This was a condensed version of about 5 or 6 different lectures. There's a lot more to say, but also there's again a serious absence of data, particularly on the smaller countries around Europe. I want to respond quickly to Jeffrey Goldberg's comment that you can't do anything out in the open in Europe anymore. Just this past weekend, I was a scholar in residence at a seminar for Limud International in Oxford. And at the end of Shabbat, we had a really, really beautiful Havdalah service out in the open in Oxford, surrounded by non-Jews watching. Certainly that's the case in parts of Europe, but it's not the case, again, everywhere. Theresa May, the British Home Secretary, mentioned Manuel Valls' speech to the French Parliament after the kosher supermarket terrorist attack. If you haven't seen it, I really encourage everyone to do so. When the documentary history, you know, those books that have documents in them that cover a particular period of time, when that's written about the 21st century, the Manuel Valls speech will almost certainly be in there. It's that important, that significant, and that critical. I want to respond to Richard's comments briefly about the ADL data. You mentioned that Sweden is the ADL found that Sweden was one of the least anti-Semitic countries in the world, and pointed out that the situation in Malmö is awful. I 100% agree, and in much the same way as we would say, there are all sorts of differences across Europe from country to country. There are also all sorts of differences within country. The reality in Stockholm is different from Malmö. The reality in London is different from Manchester, is different from Bradford, etc., etc. There is complexity. There's all sorts of layers of nuance. But the other thing I would say that the ADL data on anti-Semitism raises is that they measured anti-Semitism using a particular approach, which is looking at non-Jewish attitudes of Jews. There are other approaches. I shared some of the anti-Semitic incident data. It's another approach. Another approach is looking at levels of Jewish perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism, levels of anxiety and concern. There are multiple ways of looking at anti-Semitism, and actually what we need to do in order to understand it is look at it in those multiple ways. So that was really just one picture by one piece of, albeit landmark research, I would say. I want to try and answer all the other questions by speaking more generally. And I want to talk about mythic thinking and sloppy thinking. I think there's a lot of mythic thinking about European Jews. I don't mean myth in the sense of false, but I also don't mean factual truth. I mean myth in the sense of a fundamental truth, a story that helps us make sense of the world. And I think there's a genuine reason for that type of mythic thinking about European Jews. In fact, the American Jewish experience is grounded in it, right? So the American Jewish story begins with a tale of migration from the poverty and persecution of Europe to the golden Medina of America. And in the myth, Europe is the antithesis of America, right? Everything we fled from in order to build a better world. And that myth has served America well. It's allowed it to build a different social model where, in theory at least, there is no us and them, a host culture and guest immigrants at the mercy of hosts, but rather a strong and robust sense of we. And the Israeli experience is also grounded in mythic thinking about European Jews. The Israeli story is also a story of migration from the pogroms and Shoah of Europe to the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, to transform the Jewish people from the neurosis of their galut existence to become proud and strong members of a nation in control of its own destiny. And that myth has served Israel well. It's helped to create something here that previous generations of Jews could barely have dreamed of. An extraordinary Jewish country that's teeming with Jewish culture and creativity, the like of which has never been seen before in Jewish history. But I would say that whilst the myths have served Israel and America well, few contemporary European Jews see themselves reflected in them anymore. They are neither Emma Lazarus's huddled masses yearning to breathe free, nor do they have any part of Natan Altman's silver platter. They are, on the whole, 21st century Jews with 21st century problems, right? Figuring out where to send their kids to school from a whole host of options available to them, figuring out what career to pursue from a whole host of options available to them, figuring out whether to go on one vacation this year or 2 vacations this year. And they want, I think, to be seen by other Jews around the world for what they are, not mythic images, or in Diana Pinto's memorable phrase from an article she wrote recently, Pompeian plaster casts, but really as equals, right? Living where they are for a whole host of historical, social, and cultural reasons, but as partners in the creation of a better world with Jews around the world. That's a few words about mythic thinking. I want to say a couple of words about sloppy thinking. I want to ask you for one moment to try to stand in the shoes of the various European Union or European Commission politicians and civil servants that I've had the opportunity to work with in recent years. When they listen to non-European Jewish voices, and some European Jewish voices talk about Europe, they hear them describe a Europe that's totally overwhelmed by Quenelle-type hatred or rampant anti-Israelism. And many of them counter, you know what, we know, and we're concerned about it too, but it's very difficult because anti-Muslim hatred is also a problem. And somehow we have to navigate a way through all of this. But we're investing millions in bolstering security around Jewish sites, improving and sharing intelligence, monitoring incidents, convening groups, running conferences, developing educational programs. And the global Jewish response, more often than not, is an accusatory, you're not doing enough. You need to do more. Because when we look at Europe, all we can see is a continent overwhelmed by Quenelle-type hatred and Islamic extremism. I see versions of this conversation happening over and over again. And I also see the look on the faces of European politicians and civil servants. And it's only a matter of time, I think, before they throw up their hands in despair and say, you know what, screw you. Some of them already have. Let me try and sum up quickly then. I think we have to see European Jews as equals, as partners. And I think the role of World Jewry is to do as much as they can to empower European Jews to create meaningful Jewish lives for themselves. What will come out of that is proud Jews who will then choose whatever they're going to choose. And perhaps, you know, the best way to start doing that, I will finish with this, I promise, is for people to start visiting Europe and experiencing Europe, not just to see Auschwitz and Treblinka, and not to attend the funerals of Jewish victims of terrorism, but to experience Limud and Sarvash and Jewish cultural festivals and interfaith dialogue, and to meet with European politicians and find out what their concerns are from their perspective. And if you want to come, I'll happily organize a trip. But when you come, perhaps the fundamental challenge for this particular organization is no longer how to be the Jewish agency, but rather how to give people Jewish agency, how to empower Jews in Europe and elsewhere to draw on everything we know and love about Jewish ideas, values, and experiences to build a better Europe, not just for its own sake, but for the sake of Israel and the Jewish people, and indeed for humanity as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. To be truly European, we cannot finish without Marcel Proust. So I will ask you each a short question. Please answer the first word pops up your mind, okay? Your favorite word in Hebrew?
Balagan.
Your favorite word in English?
Pandemonium.
Your favorite food in Italy?
Pasta.
Favorite place in Israel?
Tel Aviv.
What do you love about Europe?
History.
What gives you hope in Europe?
Activism.
What annoys you in Europe?
People.
What annoys you in Israel?
People.
Your favorite quality in people?
Kindness.
And the last question will be same for all of you. If you could have a 2-hour conversation about the future of Jews in Europe with any figure in the world, live or dead, who would it be?
So I'll just answer with the first answer that comes to my mind. It would be my grandfather, who I never knew, who who I never met. He was the chief rabbi of Milan. He lost his entire family in the Holocaust, and therefore chose to go back to Milan after the Shoah because he just had nowhere to go. And I would ask him how he decided to stay and how he decided to build back the community and the family in Italy. And if he made it, then I think everybody else can.
Thank you. Just a name. Who would it be?
To be unoriginal, because his name's been mentioned already, but I think Dr. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs.
I think it probably would be with my grandchildren and asking them where they live. That would be enough.
I also thought my great-grandfather, who fought for France during the First World War. Why did he fight at the time? And would it be okay with me leaving France, or would he rather me staying there?
Merci.
I think it would be the president of the Jewish Agency, because I want to implement solution to help people. So think about the future.
That can be organized during the lunch. Yes.
Okay, good.
I think probably my future child, to ask him the questions from the future if I made the right choice.
My grandfather as well.
I think it would be Herzl, which I never thought I would say that, but I would ask him whether, is this what you wanted?
Well, I think it may be also some young leader from the Jewish community. I cannot tell from what country, each country of the Europe, because I think really each of Jews self-identifying should decide if he feels comfortable with his Jewishship, his feeling of Jews in all over the world.
Thank you very much. And I wish it could be Rami Wernick. I want to thank you all for coming here today. I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Jonathan Boyd, our speakers, Onward Israel, Massa and the Israel Experience for helping us find you, Tali David for kind assistance, David Intercontinental for transforming the space into Café Europa. Of course, our Makom, amazing team. Toda Rabba, vielen Dank, oder Wiedersehen.